The dog didn't scream like an animal. It screamed like a child trapped in the fire. The sound followed him long after that night, threading through the smoke and the sirens, through the voices shouting orders and the dull roar of collapsing timber. The old mill had been dying for years, its windows boarded and its gears rusted. But when the flames took hold, it burned with a fury that seemed almost personal. Eli Harper was 12, small for his age, and not supposed to be anywhere near the place. His mother had locked the bookstore and gone to help at the church shelter when the alarm rang, leaving him with instructions to stay put and keep the cats inside. But the moment he smelled smoke rolling down Main Street, his legs moved before his mind could stop them. The air tasted of burning resin and memory. People had gathered at the edge of the field, watching helplessly as the mill belched black smoke into the bruised sky. No one dared go near it. The fire chief shouted about a ruptured gas line, about danger, about waiting for the trucks from the next town over. Yet through the heat haze, Eli saw something move behind a broken window. Something small and frantic and alive. At first he thought it was a child. Then he heard the sound again. That strangled cry, half howl, half plea. He felt the hair rise on his arms. Everyone else flinched backward from the blast of heat. But Eli ran forward, ducking under the rope barrier before anyone could grab him. His sneakers sank into ash and mud. The heat hit him like a wall. He wrapped his sleeve around his mouth and pressed on, his mind emptied of everything except the desperate certainty that something inside that burning place was waiting for him. The door had half collapsed, hanging by one hinge. He crawled through the gap, coughing as smoke clawed at his lungs. The world became a furnace, walls glowing red, dust drifting like embers in the air. He followed the sound up a narrow stairway, one that trembled beneath his weight, until he reached a landing filled with debris. There, wedged between two fallen beams, was a dog. Or what looked like one, its fur blackened, eyes too bright in the gloom, the collar around its neck glowing faintly as if forged from moonlight instead of iron. Its paw was pinned under a charred plank. The creature's gaze found him, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw understanding in those eyes, something close to human fear. He hesitated, his every instinct screaming to run. But he remembered his mother's voice from years ago, when their last dog had been hit by a car and she had made him hold it until it stopped shaking. If you can't stop the pain, at least let it know it's not alone. The memory steadied him. He threw his weight against the beam until it shifted enough for the animal to pull free. It staggered, then collapsed against his leg. Its breath came in hot, ragged bursts, but when he reached to lift it, the fur felt shockingly cold, like touching snow. He shrugged off his jacket and wrapped it around the animal's body, ignoring the way the metal collar burned his wrist with a strange chill. Behind him, the roof groaned. The entire building shuddered. He could hear people shouting outside, faint through the roar of fire. He pressed the dog against his chest and ran. He barely made it through the doorway before the upper floor gave way in a thunderclap of splintering wood. A wall of heat chased him into the night, throwing sparks into his hair. Strong arms caught him, someone shouting his name, dragging him back. He landed in the wet grass, gasping, the jacket in his arms twitching as the dog whimpered weakly. The paramedics crowded around, trying to pull the bundle away, but he clung tighter. "It's alive," he croaked. "It's alive." They told him to let go, that it needed care, but the animal twisted at every unfamiliar touch, snapping, snarling, its eyes flashing red like coals in the dark. It calmed only when Eli spoke, his voice hoarse from smoke. "It's okay," he whispered. "I got you." The creature stilled. The paramedics exchanged uneasy glances. One of them crossed himself. The fire chief muttered something about getting the vet. That strange woman out on Hawthorne Road, who took in strays no one else could handle. Eli didn't know her, but he'd heard the stories. How she could heal anything. How animals followed her like shadows. How she never seemed to age. The townsfolk called her Dr. Vera Nocturne, though some whispered other names. When her black car pulled up through the haze, the noise around them fell away. She stepped out slowly, long coat gleaming with rain, her face pale as porcelain beneath the flashing emergency lights. Even through the smoke, her eyes caught the color of fresh blood. She walked straight toward Eli, the crowd parting without a word. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but absolute. "Give him to me." Eli hesitated. The dog shifted in his arms, pressing closer. "He's scared," he said, his voice trembling. Something flickered across the woman's face, a shadow of surprise, or perhaps recognition. "Yes," she murmured, "he should be." Then, more gently, "Let me help him, child." Eli loosened his grip, and she lifted the dog with inhuman grace, as if it weighed nothing. The collar's sigil glimmered again, a crescent tangled with a thorned rose, and for a second, the same pattern flared faintly across the woman's wrist beneath her glove. She turned away before anyone noticed, cradling the animal like a wounded heirloom. "He'll need treatment," she said over her shoulder. "Come by the clinic tomorrow if you wish to see him." Her gaze met Eli's then, steady, unsettling, and somehow familiar, as though she had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had been alive. "You were very brave," she added quietly. "Most would have let him burn." That night, Eli couldn't sleep. The fire's glow still danced behind his eyelids, and the strange burn on his wrist throbbed faintly, leaving a faint outline of the sigil imprinted on his skin. He sat by the window of the apartment above the bookstore, watching rain wash the ash from the street. His mother had said he could visit the vet in the morning, but only once, only to make sure the creature was all right. "You could have died," she'd whispered, holding him tight enough to hurt. "Promise me you'll never do something like that again." He had promised, though he didn't know if he could keep it. Because when he closed his eyes, he still heard the way the dog had cried, the same tone as a child calling for help. And he felt that something enormous and invisible had turned its gaze toward him when he ran into that fire, something ancient that had recognized his act and marked it. Down on the street, the puddles reflected the last dying lights of the mill, and somewhere beyond the clouds, the moon rose full and pale. In a house on the edge of town, Dr. Vera Nocturne stood by a narrow bed where the black dog slept beneath linen soaked with herbs and silver. Her hands hovered over its wound, tracing the sigil on its collar, but her mind was elsewhere, on the boy's face in the firelight, the purity of his fear and his refusal to let go. "It can't be," she whispered to the empty room. "They were all gone." The dog stirred in its sleep, whimpering softly, and when she touched its head, her fingertips came away glowing faintly gold instead of red. Outside, thunder rolled, and the Queen of the Undying realized that something impossible had happened tonight. A mortal child had carried fire through death and survived, and the world she had ruled from the shadows for centuries was about to change forever. Eli woke before dawn. The smell of smoke still caught in his hair, and the strange ache in his wrist pulsing with every heartbeat, as if the mark had sunk beneath the skin. His mother was already downstairs in the bookstore, restocking the shelves that smelled faintly of dust and pine soap, pretending that everything was normal. But she kept looking at him with the brittle smile of someone holding fear by its throat. He said he wanted to walk to the clinic and check on the dog. She hesitated, then sighed and handed him her old raincoat, the one patched at the elbows. "Don't stay long," she said. Dr. Nocturne isn't fond of visitors. The morning was heavy with mist, the kind that seemed to carry whispers through the trees. The town looked washed clean by the rain, but every puddle mirrored the ghost of last night's fire. Eli followed the narrow road toward the hill where the veterinary clinic sat, like an old chapel remade for the living. The sign at the gate was iron, engraved with curling letters that read, "Nocturne Veterinary Care. All creatures welcome." The path leading up to it was lined with roses that shouldn't have been blooming this late in autumn, their petals dark as blood. The windows glowed faintly even though the sky was gray, and for a moment Eli thought he saw movement behind one, someone watching, then vanishing before he could wave. Inside, the clinic smelled of herbs and candle smoke rather than disinfectant. Shelves lined with jars and vials reached almost to the ceiling, each labeled in looping handwriting he couldn't read. A clock ticked somewhere unseen, its rhythm slower than any he'd heard before, as if time itself walked cautiously here. A bell chimed softly when he stepped in, and the sound echoed far longer than it should have. He felt as though he had entered another world, a quieter, older one where whispers had weight. A woman's voice drifted from the back room. "You're early." He turned, startled, to see Dr. Nocturne standing in the doorway, her dark hair pinned back, her pale hands bare now, delicate as marble. In the clearer light, she seemed less human, not because of anything monstrous, but because of the precision of her stillness, as though the smallest motion would break her. Her eyes held the same deep red hue he'd thought was only a trick of firelight, and yet there was warmth in them, faint, but real. "The dog," Eli said quickly. "You told me to come if I wanted to see him." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "He's in the recovery room. But you must be quiet. He's temperamental." She led him down a narrow hall lined with old photographs, animals standing beside people whose faces had long faded into shadow, horses with glowing eyes, a wolf sitting calmly beside a woman who might have been Vera herself decades earlier. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until his breath began to fog. The room at the end was lit only by a circle of lamps surrounding a low bed where the black dog lay swathed in bandages. Its breathing was shallow but steady, the metal collar still encircled its neck, though it no longer glowed. Eli moved closer, his steps barely making a sound. The dog's ear twitched, its eyes opened, red, faint but unmistakable, and when they met his, the rhythm of the lamps flickered, as though reacting to some unseen pulse between them. "He remembers you," Vera said softly behind him. "That's unusual." Eli smiled a little, relief breaking through his fear. "He's alive, then." "Alive, yes," she murmured. "Though the word doesn't mean quite the same thing for him as it does for you." She came to stand beside him, and for the first time, he noticed that she cast no reflection in the glass of the cabinet beside them. Her hand brushed the dog's fur, and for a moment her fingers glowed with faint crimson light that sank into the creature's wounds. The smell of iron filled the air. "What's wrong with him?" Eli asked. "He shouldn't have survived the fire," she said, as if to herself. "And yet here he is, and you with him." When she turned her gaze on him again, it was sharp enough to make him step back. "Tell me exactly what happened last night." Eli told her everything. The fire, the scream, the way the collar had burned cold, the way the dog had calmed when he spoke. As he spoke, she moved slowly around him, listening like a hunter tracing the wind. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time. Then she asked, almost gently, "And you touched the mark?" He nodded. "It was just a collar." "Not just," she corrected. "That sigil is older than this town. It binds the creature to whoever bears its twin." She reached for his wrist, and he flinched, but she only turned his hand palm up. There, beneath the skin, faint but undeniable, was the same crescent and rose pattern, glowing softly like a buried ember. It marked you. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's impossible. He stared at the faint light trembling beneath his skin. What does it mean? It means, she said, drawing back, that something ancient has taken notice of you, and that is rarely a blessing. The dog whined softly, struggling to rise, and Eli instinctively reached out to steady it. Vera moved to stop him, but the moment his hand touched the creature's head, it stilled, eyes closing in what looked almost like peace. The glow under his skin brightened, pulsing in rhythm with the dog's heartbeat. You see, she breathed, even my power couldn't calm him. But you... She broke off, her eyes narrowing as though seeing something beyond him. What are you, boy? Just me, he said, frightened. I didn't do anything. You ran into a burning building for a beast no one else would touch. That isn't nothing. The lamps flickered again, and for an instant the walls seemed to breathe, the shadows bending toward him. Vera straightened, pulling the air back into stillness. You should go home, she said abruptly. You've done enough. But as he turned to leave, the dog whined again, a low sound that trembled like pleading. Eli hesitated. He doesn't want me to. Vera's eyes glimmered with something between frustration and awe. He shouldn't want anything. He's bound to my bloodline, not yours. Maybe he doesn't know that, Eli said quietly. Maybe he just knows I helped him. That answer silenced her. For a heartbeat, the centuries in her face melted away, leaving a woman caught between two worlds, the ruler of night and the faint echo of the mortal she once was. She reached out, almost touching his hair, then pulled her hand back as if burned. There are laws older than you can imagine, she said, and you've stepped right through them. He didn't understand, not yet, but something in her tone made his chest tighten. Am I in trouble? He asked. She gave a small, bitter smile. Not yet. But those who would see you punished are already waking. She moved to the door, opening it with a flick of her fingers. The latch turned by itself, metal bending under unseen pressure. Go, she said softly, and keep that mark hidden. Do not tell anyone what you saw. He hesitated, glancing back at the dog, which had curled into itself again, eyes following him. Will he be all right? He will heal, she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty that frightened him more than any wound could. You have my word. As he stepped out into the mist, she called after him. Eli Harper. He froze. How do you know my name? Names have power, she said simply, and yours is echoing in places it shouldn't. He walked home with the mist thick around him, feeling as though unseen eyes trailed every step. The mark on his wrist throbbed like a second pulse. When he reached the bookstore, his mother was waiting on the porch, worry etched into her face. You've been gone too long, she scolded gently. But when she saw his hand, she frowned. What happened there? He hid it quickly. Just a burn. She studied him for a long moment but didn't press. That night, the dreams began. He saw the fire again, but this time it burned without smoke, blue and silent, and from its heart rose a woman crowned in roses of iron, her eyes filled with sorrow. She spoke his name, and the sound made the mark on his wrist flare with light. He woke, gasping, the room cold as winter. Outside, the town lay still, but in the distance, high on Hawthorne Hill, a single window of the clinic glowed red as if a heartbeat pulsed behind the glass. Inside that light, Vera stood before the sleeping dog, her reflection absent from every mirror, her expression unreadable. He shouldn't exist, she whispered. Not again. She pressed a hand to her chest, where her own sigil lay dormant, feeling it stir for the first time in centuries. A child marked by the sunblood. If the council learns of him, they will destroy him, and me with him. The dog stirred and let out a low growl, a warning that something was approaching. Outside, unseen, shadows moved along the tree line, their eyes catching what little moonlight there was. The Queen of the Undying turned toward them, her calm expression sharpening into something deadly. Let them come, she murmured. But if they touch that boy, I will remind them what fear truly means. By the time the next evening descended, the town had begun to whisper. Children told stories about the fire that still smelled of brimstone, and older folk swore they had seen a black creature limping through the fog before dawn, its eyes glowing like the last coals of a dying hearth. Eli tried to ignore them, yet the stories followed him like smoke. He felt the pulse of the mark beneath his sleeve, faint but steady, as if some hidden clock had been set, ticking inside him. The day passed in a haze of school and worry. When dusk settled over the rooftops and the lamps began to flicker to life, he told his mother he was going to close the shutters at the bookstore. Instead, he slipped out the back door and followed the road toward Hawthorne Hill again. He hesitated only once, then pushed open the gate. The door was unlocked, the bell above it silent as though muted by an unseen hand. Inside, the lamps burned low, their light drawn into long ribbons by the moving shadows that seemed to breathe along the walls. "Dr. Nocturne?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her. No answer came, only the sound of water dripping somewhere distant and the faint rhythm of an animal's heartbeat. He followed it through the hallway until he reached the recovery room. The dog, no, not a dog now, not really, was standing on the floor beside the overturned bed, its wounds closed, but its shape somehow altered. The bandages hung in tatters, and the iron collar glowed faintly, as if alive. The creature lifted its head at his approach. Its eyes were still red, but they had softened. It gave a low whine that rose almost to a word. "Hey," he whispered, kneeling. "You're up." The mark on his wrist flared as his fingers brushed the creature's muzzle, and an image flashed through his mind. A field of snow under a crimson moon, a woman in armor kneeling beside a beast that looked exactly like this one. He jerked his hand back, gasping. A voice spoke behind him, quiet but edged with command. "You should not be here after dark." He turned and saw her standing at the threshold, wearing a long coat the color of smoke, her eyes bright in the dim light. She looked different tonight, not merely tired, but ancient, as if she had stepped out of some forgotten painting. "He's awake," Eli said quickly. "He's walking." "I know," she replied. "I felt it." She crossed the room with the fluid grace of something that had forgotten how to be entirely human. The creature lowered its head as she passed, and for a moment, the air smelled of iron and roses. "He shouldn't be strong enough to move," she murmured, kneeling beside it. "Unless—" Her gaze flicked to Eli, then to his hidden wrist. "Show me." He hesitated. "The mark. Show me." He rolled up his sleeve. The sigil pulsed faintly like a heartbeat under glass. She reached out, her cold fingers tracing the outline without touching it. "It has rooted itself," she said under her breath. "And through it, he draws your life. He is healing because of you." "Then that's good, right?" She gave a faint, humorless smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it means he will never let you go." She rose, the folds of her coat whispering like wings. "I need to show you something." She gestured for him to follow. They passed through a door he hadn't noticed before, descending a narrow stair into what must once have been the cellar. The air grew colder with each step. the walls carved from stone that glimmered faintly with veins of silver. At the bottom waited a chamber lit by dozens of candles. In the center stood a basin carved from black marble, filled with liquid that shimmered like quicksilver. Symbols surrounded it, old, foreign, alive. "What is this place?" he asked. "A sanctuary," she said, "and a prison. This is where my kind once bound creatures of shadow to serve our bloodline." She gestured toward the stair where the creature had followed, silent as a ghost, was one of the last, a guardian forged from flame and loyalty. He should have perished centuries ago. "You mean, he's yours?" Her expression flickered. "He was. Before the wars burned our world to ash. I buried him myself." She looked at Eli, and for the first time her composure cracked. "You pulled him from the fire as if it were nothing. Do you understand what that means? You reached through death and called him back. No mortal should have that power." The mark on his wrist throbbed again, stronger now, filling the air with a faint hum that made the candle flames bend toward him. The creature growled softly, not in threat, but in recognition. Vera stepped back, her eyes widening. "He is binding himself to you completely. I can feel the tether." "Can't you stop it?" Eli asked, frightened. "If I sever it, he will die, and perhaps you with him." She turned away, muttering words in a language older than any church, her voice trembling for the first time. This is what I feared. When she looked back at him, the crimson in her eyes burned brighter. "Listen carefully, Eli. You must stay away from others tonight. If anyone sees that mark, they will understand what has happened, and there are those who will kill you to erase it." "Who?" "My kind," she said simply. "The council that believes purity is worth more than mercy. They would rather see a world of ashes than admit that a human child carries the blessing of our blood." Her words should have sounded insane, but the air itself seemed to shift as she spoke. Shadows stirred at the edges of the room, taking faint humanoid shapes before fading again. The guardian, whined and pressed against Eli's side as if to shield him. "He will protect you now," she said, "until I can understand what bond you've created." He wanted to ask more, but the sound of footsteps echoed above them, slow and deliberate. Vera's head snapped up, every trace of softness gone. "Stay here," she ordered. "Don't move." She vanished up the stair in a blur of motion that left the candles guttering in her wake. He waited, heart hammering, hearing the low murmur of voices overhead, one cold and mocking, the other Vera's, sharp as glass. Then a crash. The guardian snarled and bolted for the stairs despite Eli's shout. He followed before he could think, stumbling into the main hall. A man in a long, dark coat stood by the doorway, his skin pale as chalk, eyes gleaming like coins. He held a silver blade that smoked faintly in the lamplight. "So it's true," the stranger said. "You've been playing with forbidden fire again, Vera." She stood between him and the boy, her back rigid, her voice icy calm. "Leave. He's under my protection." The man's smile showed teeth too sharp to be human. "You don't have the authority anymore. The council wants the creature and the boy both. They're an infection." Eli felt the guardian move beside him, hackles rising, heat rolling from its body like a furnace. "Run!" Vira whispered without turning. "Take him and run!" But before Eli could move, the man raised his blade, and the air filled with a sound like breaking glass. A blast of force threw him backward. He hit the wall hard enough to see stars. The guardian lunged, colliding with the intruder in a snarl of fire and shadow. Sparks filled the room. Vera's eyes flared crimson as she uttered a single word, and the silver in the man's blade melted into liquid light. He hissed, retreating toward the door. "This isn't over," he spat. "The council knows about the boy. They will come for him." Then he was gone, swallowed by the night. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of dying energy. Vera turned slowly, her face paled even for her. "It has begun," she said. The Guardian limped back to Eli's side and pressed its head against his chest. He looked up at her, trembling. "Who was that?" "A messenger," she said. "And a warning." She closed the doors with a wave of her hand, the locks sealing with a sound like grinding stone. "You cannot go home now. They'll watch the streets, waiting for you to lead them here. For tonight, you stay under my roof." He wanted to argue, but exhaustion washed through him, heavy and irresistible. She guided him to a small room, lined with books and strange relics, its windows covered in thick velvet drapes. "Sleep," she said, her voice soft again. "The dawn will come soon enough." As he lay down, he saw her silhouette against the doorway, still and regal. "Why are you helping me?" he asked drowsily. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she said, almost to herself, "Because once, long ago, someone saved me from a fire too." The door closed. He drifted into uneasy dreams, where fire turned to water, and the Guardian walked beside him, whispering words he couldn't understand. When he woke at dawn, the room was cold, and faint sunlight slipped through the cracks of the curtains, touching his skin without warmth. From somewhere deep below, he heard the toll of an unseen bell. The sound was mournful, ancient, and he realized that whatever had happened last night had changed everything. Upstairs, in the clinic's main hall, Vera stood alone before a cracked mirror, watching the reflection she no longer possessed. "He's bound to you now," she whispered to the phantom glass, "and through him, the world will find us again." She turned away as the first rays of the sun broke across the mist, her eyes glinting like garnet. So be it. The days that followed were heavy with silence, as if the whole town were holding its breath. The smoke had cleared from the hills, yet Eli still felt the fire in his dreams, the same crimson light that pulsed beneath his skin when he woke. Darto Nocturne let him stay in the upper rooms of the clinic, where the curtains were always drawn, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and iron. She spoke little, moving through the corridors with a precision that seemed rehearsed across centuries. At night, he sometimes heard her voice murmuring in a language that didn't sound like words, more like wind scraping stone. The Guardian, the creature that had once been a dog, never left his side, sleeping curled at the foot of his bed, like a shadow with a heartbeat. When he touched its fur, warmth flooded through him, but it was the kind of warmth that belonged to candlelight, not to the sun. He asked questions that Vira rarely answered. Each time he mentioned the man who had attacked them, her expression tightened, the crimson in her eyes darkening like a bruise. On the third evening, she summoned him to the great hall beneath the clinic, a room he had not entered before. The air there hummed faintly, and the floor was carved with the same sigils that marked his wrist. Candles stood in glass bowls filled with dark water, their flames mirrored upside down, as though two worlds were burning in opposite directions. She stood beside an altar made of black stone and motioned him closer. "The council knows you exist," she said. "That messenger was only the first. They will send others soon, those who believe mercy weakens the bloodline." Eli stared at her, trying to make sense of the words. "Why do they care about me?" "Because you are proof that their laws are lies," she said softly. "Because no mortal should be able to bind what belongs to the darkness, and yet you did. You walked into fire and called something back that should have remained in the grave. To them, you are an infection that must be cut out. She turned to the guardian, who sat alert beside him, eyes glimmering. And you, creature of my blood, disobeyed your queen to answer a child's call. That too they will punish. Eli swallowed, his throat dry. Then what are we going to do? She studied him for a long time, and then, in a voice that trembled only slightly, she said, "We are going to hide. But not here." She waved her hand over the altar, and the air shimmered. The candles bent inward, as though a breath had drawn them. The image that appeared above the stone was of a ruined monastery hidden deep in the forest, its windows veiled with ivy, and its bell tower leaning as if the weight of centuries had bent it toward the earth. "This place is old," she said, "built when my kind still walked under the open sky. Its walls are bound with a spell that allows no creature to enter without permission. We will be safe there for a time." "You sound like you don't believe it," he said quietly. She gave a weary smile. "Safety is a word for those who still believe in peace." That night, they left the clinic under a sky thick with clouds. Vera drove an old black car whose engine made no sound at all, gliding through the streets as though it ran on shadow instead of fuel. The town looked different through the fogged glass, houses leaning closer, windows reflecting light that wasn't there. The further they drove from the main road, the more the world seemed to dissolve into mist, until even the headlights couldn't find the edges of the forest. Eli dozed against the window, waking only when the car stopped before the gates of the monastery. It stood on a cliff overlooking the river, its stones pale as bone, its gates covered with rusted symbols that pulsed faintly when Vera touched them. The gates opened without a sound. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the scent of old prayers lingering like smoke. Candles burned in niches along the walls, though no one had lit them. Vera led him through long corridors until they reached a chamber at the heart of the structure. "This place will protect us," she said, tracing a circle in the air with one finger. "Nothing can enter without my consent." "But how do you know they won't find a way?" he asked. "Because," she said, "they will think I've taken you far away, to one of my old sanctuaries in the mountains. They'll search everywhere but here." Her voice faltered for a moment. "Unless someone tells them otherwise." Eli frowned. "You mean a traitor?" "There's always one," she said softly, "in every kingdom, in every family. Someone who believes fear will save them." She brushed the dust from an old stone bench and sat down. "I once had a council of 12. When the wars ended, I trusted them to rule in my absence. Some remained loyal. Some found comfort in cruelty. The one who sent that messenger was once my commander. He knows how I think, how I hide. He will not stop until he finds you." Eli sat beside her, the guardian resting its head on his knee. "Why?" he asked again. "Why do you care what happens to me? You could have given me to them and been safe." Her eyes flicked toward the far wall, where a fresco half buried in dust showed a woman cradling a child beneath a sky of flames. "Once I had a son," she said, so quietly he barely heard her. "He was born before the curse that bound our kind to darkness. He could walk in sunlight, a bridge between worlds. When the council began its purges, they called him an abomination. I tried to protect him. I failed." Her voice caught for the first time. "When I saw you in the fire with that creature in your arms, I thought for a moment that time had undone itself, that I was being given another chance to choose differently." He didn't know what to say, so he reached out and placed his hand on hers. Her skin was cold but alive, a pulse deep beneath the surface. The guardian lifted its head as if recognizing the bond. "You don't have to protect me," he whispered. "I'm not special. "That is exactly why you are," she said, meeting his eyes. "You acted without knowledge, without promise of reward. You simply chose compassion. That is the one power my kind has always feared most, because it reminds us of what we lost." She stood, her long coat sweeping the floor like a shadow. "Rest now. Tomorrow I must send word to an old friend who can shield us from the Council's eyes. His loyalty is uncertain, but he owes me a debt." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Eli, no matter what happens, do not cross the threshold of this place without my permission. The forest beyond is older than you can imagine, and it does not forgive trespass." When she was gone, the monastery seemed to breathe around him, the wind sighing through the broken arches above. He lay down on a narrow bed, the guardian curling beside him. Sleep came slowly. He dreamed of a vast hall filled with mirrors, where a woman crowned in roses argued with men made of shadow. Their voices were thunder. One by one they turned toward him, and he saw that their faces were all the same, pale, pitiless, ancient. He woke with a start. The candles had gone out. A faint light seeped from the cracks in the walls, pulsing like the rhythm of a distant heartbeat. The guardian growled softly, its fur rising. Somewhere in the darkness, a bell tolled once, low and mournful. At dawn, Vera returned, her expression grim. "The Council has declared me a traitor," she said simply. "They will not forgive this." She moved through the room, touching the walls as though sealing them. "The sanctuary will hold, but we cannot stay long. They have spies even among mortals." "What about my mother?" Eli asked, panic rising. "They won't hurt her, will they?" Vira hesitated before answering. "They rarely touch innocence," she said, "but their definition of innocence is narrow. We have to warn her. If you go back, you will lead them straight to her. Sometimes the hardest kindness is absence." She met his gaze. "Do you trust me?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Then stay behind the wards until I return. I'll come back before nightfall." When she left, the day passed in uneasy quiet. The monastery felt emptier without her presence, as though the walls themselves waited for her voice. Eli wandered the corridors, tracing the faded frescoes that showed stories he didn't know. Battles beneath burning moons, kings crowned in shadow, a woman standing between light and dark, holding a rose made of fire. The guardian followed him silently. In one chamber he found an old lectern covered with dust. A book lay open upon it, its pages written in looping script that shimmered faintly when he touched them. The words rearranged themselves into shapes he almost understood. Phrases about bonds forged in compassion, about blood that heals as it burns. He closed it quickly, unnerved by the way the letters seemed to watch him. By evening he stood in the cloister, watching the last light fade from the sky. The forest stretched below, a dark sea of motionless trees. He thought he saw figures moving among them, shapes that glowed faintly, too tall and too graceful to be human. The guardian pressed close to his leg, growling low. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was. He turned back toward the door, just as a gust of cold air swept through the corridor, extinguishing every candle. In the darkness he heard it again. The bell, tolling twice this time, each note carrying the weight of a warning. He ran to the nearest window and looked out. Far below, at the edge of the forest, a single torch burned. Then another, then dozens, forming a ring of fire around the hill. He felt the mark on his wrist ignite with heat. "Vira," he breathed, but she was nowhere in sight. And as the first scream echoed from the trees, he understood that the sanctuary's peace had been only the calm before the storm. The torch throbbed inside the stone like a warning heart. He felt the monastery tense around him. Every arch and corridor and silent statue drawing a breath it could not release. And in that suspended moment, he understood that the spell Vera had trusted would be tested not by brute force, but by knowledge, because only knowledge could find the key hidden inside an oath. And knowledge meant betrayal, which meant somewhere not far away, a mouth had spoken his name to someone who would never say it kindly. He called for Vera until his throat hurt, yet only the bell answered, and then even that fell silent as the first voice floated up from the outer court, a smooth voice that treated the night like a theater, and the darkness like an audience, announcing itself without haste, because haste is for those who fear time, and this one had no such fear. The words were simple and terrible. Permission requested, permission granted, permission claimed by ancient privilege. And at the sound of that formula, the sigils woven into the thresholds did not shatter so much as turn their faces away like servants obeying a master they despise, and the gates, which had told Eli with their silence that they were more iron than metal, unlatched with a sigh that carried centuries of arguments resolved by blood. He did not see who spoke first, only the consequence. Men and women in long coats that drank starlight and reflected torch fire in narrow red lanes stepped through in orderly rows, their movements so disciplined that it was almost beautiful until you noticed the purpose behind it, and among them, a taller figure advanced with the unhurried confidence of someone who believes in the inevitability of his will, his hair bound back with a strip of leather, his gloves white and immaculate despite the climb, his blade sheathed in a scabbard etched with the thorned rose, and when he paused beneath the broken saint that crowned the inner gate, the guardian at Eli's side pressed closer and made a sound that was less growl than memory, as if some deep part of it recognized the man the way an old scar recognizes rain. The intruders did not rush. They walked through the cloister like owners returning to a neglected home, noting the cracks in the stone and the places where ivy had learned to write its patient alphabet across the walls. And it was only when the leader lifted his gaze to the balcony where Eli stood that the moment hardened into shape, because the man smiled without mirth and inclined his head as though greeting a child in a garden, and the pity in that gesture cut deeper than any knife. "Found," he said, and though his voice was not loud, the arches carried it to every corner, so it became both a whisper and a proclamation. And then he named Eli with a precision that made the mark under the boy's skin sting like it had been slapped, and he invited him to come down for your own comfort and for the sake of those who prefer civility to force, a phrase that sounded so polished and reasonable that Eli almost stepped forward out of habit, because in classrooms and grocery stores and polite company one is taught that compliance is safety, and only something older and stranger. The memory of Vera's eyes when she said, "Do not cross the threshold without my permission," kept his hands clenched on the rail. "She's not here," the man observed mildly, as if discussing the absence of a dinner host, and he turned his head a fraction, just enough that the torchlight laid a line along his cheekbone, and in that profile, Eli saw the echo of the messenger in the clinic, the same elegant cruelty, and he understood this must be the commander Vera had once trusted. "It will be easier," the commander continued, "if you descend now, with the beast muzzled and your hands visible, so that the law may be applied with minimal damage to the structure." And he laid his palm against the nearest column with a gesture of weary affection, as though he regretted the necessity of breaking old things, which is always how those who break them prefer to feel. Eli did not answer. He could not trust his voice, and in any case the commander did not require an answer, because he had already raised one hand slightly, almost lazily, and the soldiers responded in two fluid currents, one angling toward the refectory and one toward the side gate, where the sigils still glowed faintly, like tired watchmen rubbing their eyes, while a third rank stayed with him in the court, each carrying a length of chain that did not ring like metal, but sang in a thin high way that set Eli's teeth on edge. And before Eli could decide whether to retreat deeper into the monastery or stand in the open and hope for Vera's return, the guardian moved, not lunging, but flowing down the stairs like poured fire, placing itself between the boy and the advancing line. And when the closest soldier made the mistake of looking directly into its eyes, he faltered and forgot the lesson of discipline long enough for the creature to shoulder him aside, not wounding him, merely reminding him that fear has its own geometry. The commander's smile thinned. "You see how attachment corrupts a tool," he said, almost to himself. "Once, it would have bitten through a child's throat on my command, and asked only whether it was necessary. Now it stands like a household pet. And for what? Because a boy with ash in his hair and kindness in his hands lifted it from a furnace. We cannot allow this, little one. We cannot allow symbols to forget their meanings." He lifted 2 fingers, and the second wave came not as bodies, but as sound. A chord that had no place in a human mouth, woven of hunger and command and the memory of old vows. And at that chord, the chain sang louder, while the air itself seemed to acquire weight, flattening the candles along the walls and pressing the breath from Eli's lungs. And the guardian staggered, as if the floor had tilted beneath it. Claws scrabbling for purchase on stone that suddenly seemed slick with oil. Eli stumbled down the stair without choosing to, because the bond tugged him into the space where harm would be greatest, and he found himself close enough to see the commander's eyes, which were not red like Vera's, but a pale river water green, rimmed with frost, and to smell the clove and iron scent of the soldiers that said they were ready for blood, but not eager for it, because eagerness breeds mistakes. "There," the commander murmured. "That's better." And for a heartbeat, Eli considered obeying, not from belief or surrender, but from the exhausted desire for any end to the pressure. And then the guardian wrenched itself free of the cords invisible, hand and rose with its fur flaming at the tips, like a field of tall grass catching. And the commander's head turned very slightly in what might have been surprise, and he said one word: "Muzzle," with an authority that had probably bent kings, and 3 soldiers moved as one, swinging the singing chains wide so they looped around the creature's neck and forelegs and drew tight with a sound that made Eli taste copper. The guardian did not cry out, because crying out belongs to those who believe their pain will be heard and answered. Instead, it lowered its head and leaned forward against the chains, as if pulling a cart up a hill, and the chains smoked where they touched its fur, and the soldiers shifted their stance to resist, and the commander reached for the last length, the one etched with sigils that mirrored the mark beneath Eli's skin, and seeing that metal with his sign engraved upon it, broke. Something in the boy that fear had not broken, because it felt like watching someone forge a collar from your own name, and he moved without thinking, throwing himself between chain and throat, catching the etched links with his forearms so that the marks pressed into the burn the fire had left there, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. And then everything did. Heat surged up through the chain, as if memory had found the vein it had been hunting, and Eli's blood went from cold to sun in a single roar that did not make a sound, and the sigil under his skin unfolded like a flower opening too fast. And where the links bit, they were not iron anymore, but line and arc and petal, and the pattern leapt from metal into flesh, and from flesh into air, and the courtyard was suddenly full of light that did not come from torches or stars, light that had texture and intention, that knew exactly where he ended and the guardian began, and where harm was trying to walk between, and that light lifted itself into a dome before anyone present could name it. For one long breath, the world stood amazed. Even the commander's face lost its polish and became merely the face of a man who has just seen a myth choose the wrong side. And then the soldiers closest to the barrier pushed forward as trained bodies will always do, and the result was immediate and merciless, because the light did not burn them like fire, which cauterizes and forgives, but like noon, which denies and reveals, and where it touched the chains they vaporized in little silver sighs, and where it touched skin it left no wound but a mark, a delicate inversion of Eli's sigil, as if to say, "Now you know we saw you." The Guardian shook itself once, tasting freedom with skepticism as if expecting its taste to be a trick, then turned to Eli and pressed its muzzle into his ribs so hard it hurt, as if trying to push him back into his own body. And Eli realized dimly that he was no longer standing so much as being held in place by the architecture of the light he had become, and that if he let go of concentration even a little, the dome would shatter like glass because it was made of trust and not of stone. The commander recovered faster than the others, as men who have rehearsed their resilience always do, and he gestured with his bare hand, testing the barrier with a series of short, precise pressures that told Eli with horrible clarity that he was measuring the limits not only of the light, but of the boy's endurance. And then he smiled again, but differently now, with teeth, because he had found what he needed to find. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, we can work with this." And he lifted his left hand and snapped his fingers, a tiny sound that nevertheless carried like a bell struck over water. And the troops who had streamed into the side passages returned with something Eli hadn't feared only because he had not imagined it. Villagers, chosen for their ordinariness and their usefulness as instruments. A butcher with his apron still on, a girl from the apothecary, a pair of men whose boots left the same salt pattern on the monastery floor that Eli's mother's boots left on the bookstore stair in winter, all of them with their hands bound but their eyes open, not yet hurt, because hurt would complicate leverage. "We are not cruel by habit," the commander told the dome conversationally, as if addressing a guest behind a window. "We prefer negotiations to disasters. Open your door, little son, and we will take only the aberration, and the problem of you will be solved elsewhere. Leave it closed, and we will begin with these, slowly, carefully, and I will record each name for your conscience to carry, which is, I suspect, much stronger than your magic." Eli felt the words like fingers working at a knot, loosening not the spell, but the boy inside it, because he could see the butcher's cracked nails and the apothecary girl's trembling jaw, and he could not bear the idea that anyone should carry a bruise because he had been brave and foolish in a fire, and his attention faltered, and immediately the dome thinned to the width of a whisper, and immediately the soldiers saw it and leaned their shoulders into, the pressure like oarsmen feeling the river slacken, and immediately the Guardian snarled and bit his sleeve as if he were a pup needing correction, and the shock of that mundane reprimand steadied him in a way the grand stakes had not. And he remembered Vera saying, "Trust is a law older than any council," and he chose to trust the woman who had told him to stay behind the threshold, and the creature who had chosen him for reasons he still didn't understand. "Let them go," he said, finding his voice from some cold well under the furnace. "Let them all go, and I will come with you." And if he meant it, he did not know, but the commander believed him enough to watch his face closely. Before any bargain could congeal into fate, the sky changed. It did not lighten as before with torch fire, but darkened with a sudden sweep of cloud that moved against the wind. The torches dimmed, as if someone had pinched the air between finger and thumb, and a sound rose not from the forest, but from the stones. Underfoot, a low hum that swelled into a chord that was the inverse of the council's, woven not of command, but of grief, and through that chord came the scent of roses drowned in rain. Every head turned without choosing to, even Eli's, though turning cost him strength, and they looked to the arch where the broken saint stood and saw nothing, and then they looked again and saw Vera in the nothing, not stepping through a door, because doors are for those who need permission, but appearing as water appears after drought, with inevitability and anger. She did not speak, because speech is too small for some moments. She raised her hand, and the villagers' bonds fell away like cut hair, and she flicked 2 fingers, and they found themselves outside the ring of soldiers without having crossed the space. Between! And she snapped her wrist, and the commander's measured calm shattered like lacquer exposed to heat, because the blade at his hip leapt from its sheath and lay at her feet, like a dog that remembers its first owner. Relief cracked Eli's focus, and the dome faltered to a thin translucence, less a wall than a skin, and the commander saw it and lunged, faster than seemed possible, not to kill him, because that would waste the utility of a symbol, but to drive a needle's worth of silver into Eli's forearm where the mark burned brightest, a tiny wound chosen for its meaning rather than its size, and Vira moved. But even queens cannot be in 2 places at once, and the only body that could cross the gap in time was the Guardian's, which threw itself between steel and boy, taking the narrow blade into its own flesh with a sound like a snared breath. And then the commander twisted, and the slender weapon tore a line that opened farther than any narrow blade. Should have been able to open, because silver remembers how to wound beautifully, and blood hit the inside of the dome, and where it landed the light blazed white and then red, and then something both, and the barrier roared up not into clarity but into opaqueness that made the world outside look like figures moving behind theater gauze. Eli fell to his knees with the Guardian's weight across his thighs, and in that instant, the animal that was not an animal was small again. Or perhaps it was only the boy's vision blurring, but he saw not flame and chain, but a frightened creature, shaking in a burned mill, and he put his hand on its head and said the word he had said that night, "I've got you." And his blood, which had been content until now to be a key and a wall, decided to be a river, and it poured out through his palm into the creature's wound and met the silver there, and devoured it with a sound so soft it might have been forgiveness, and the Guardian's eyes, which had been red since the first moment Eli had seen them, turned for one impossible second, a clear, child brown that reflected only the boy and not the flames, and then the creature convulsed and went still, not dead, not gone, but somewhere between, the way a coal looks dead until breath finds it. The dome did not vanish. It thickened and withdrew at once, contracting until it lay like a second skin just above Eli's own, a sheath of light that bled with him, and beyond it the world resumed in furious detail. Vira, with her hands lifted and her mouth open in a sound that bent the air, soldiers crumpling like paper in rain, the commander stepping backward, not from fear but to lengthen the field, because men like him are never more dangerous than when they look like they are giving ground. She reached for Eli then, but the barrier refused her with the impersonal cruelty of a law that cannot make exceptions, and she faltered, and he saw in her face a terrible calculation, a mother's arithmetic, adding up lives and years and regrets. And then she did something he had not imagined. she began to sing. The melody was not beautiful in any way he could have explained. It was older than beauty and simpler than sorrow, built from the notes that days make when they line up into years. And as it wound through the courtyard, the barrier shifted its texture, relaxing the way a heartbeat relaxes between throbs, and light thinned to transparency. And her hands came through not as force, but as shelter. And she gathered him with careful strength and said words he only half heard because the ground chose can look like retreat if the goal was only to draw blood and measure a weapon. When the tilt corrected and the lean subsided, the courtyard held only Vera and Eli and the Guardian, and a scatter of chains cooling like snakes after lightning. And the villagers were gone, and the torches on the hill were going out one by one as if a giant pinched them, and the night returned with the rudeness of an interrupted conversation. Vera pressed her forehead to Eli's, which felt too intimate to witness even from inside his own skull, and she said, finally with words, that he had done something that could not be undone, and therefore must be named, that he had summoned Sunblood in, a place where the sun had not been welcome for centuries, that the council would not forgive this, not because they were offended, but because they were afraid, and that fear, when it belongs to institutions, always becomes policy. She lifted the Guardian from his lap and laid it in the curve of her coat as if the fabric could remember warmth, and she looked at the wound, which already showed more light than blood, and she looked at Eli's arm, where the silver bite had become a small. He wanted to sleep for a week and wake in the bookstore with his mother, scolding him for forgetting to pull the display table in out of the rain, and he wanted to keep the dome solid forever and make a tiny country where only he and the Guardian and Vera could live, and he wanted to stand and walk out to the edge of the hill and shout his name at the forest so the commander would come back and he could trade himself for the safety of the town. But he could do none of those things because the barrier had begun to flicker, not with weakness, but with decision, like a door that has realized which way it opens. And Vyra, whose eyes had warmed almost imperceptibly when he put his hand on the Guardian, straightened and became all command again, and she said they would not be granted a second night of sanctuary, that the traitor would not be content with the measure he had taken, that he would return with laws and witnesses and knives shaped like promises, and that before dawn the boy must be moved through paths that did not belong to roads or maps. And she asked him if he could stand, and he said yes, because sometimes the truth must be told to the future rather than to the present. The last thing he saw before the monastery's inner door swallowed them was the broken saint above the arch, which in the slant of torch ghost light looked less broken than bowed, as if even stone could recognize the moment when a child had drawn a circle around a life and said mine to guard, and he had the absurd thought that if he lived long enough, he would bring a ladder and climb up there and push the saint's head gently back so it could see the sky, because some wounds, once understood, can be lifted if not healed. Then the darkness closed, and the world became corridors, and the rustle of Vera's coat, and the pulse of his mark, arguing with the beat of the Guardian's heart. And somewhere behind them, the commander gathered his people and wrote a report whose words would travel faster than any car. And somewhere ahead of them, the forest rearranged its roots to make room for a path that was not supposed to exist. And in the space between, where stories decide whether to become tragedies or revolutions, a boy tried not to cry because crying would make breathing hurt more, and a queen allowed herself, just for the length of a single step, to be something less than immortal and more than alone. The forest swallowed them and gave them back in a place that was not on any map, the path unspooling beneath Vera's feet, as if roots remembered an older allegiance. And when the last of the monastery's stones had dissolved into distance, the air. Changed from the mineral breath of catacombs to a resinous hush that tasted of pine and storms. And Eli, half carried and half walking with the Guardian's weight against his side, felt the world growing colder but clearer, as if the night itself were sobering. He asked where she was taking them, and Vera said only home, though the words sounded less like comfort and more like a verdict. And when the trees parted, they stood on a black terrace carved from the mountain's shoulder, facing a palace that looked built from nightfall and memory, all spires and galleries, and mirrored windows that reflected no one. And as the gates opened, he understood that the place had been waiting for her. The way a held breath waits for the body to decide whether to speak or drown. Inside, everything moved with the precision of a ritual resumed. Servants who were not human and not quite beast knelt with eyes lowered. Braziers exhaled a dark perfume that did not smoke, but still wrote its presence on the tongue. Bells tolled in, patterns that made the air vibrate around the mark on his wrist. And as Vera crossed the antechamber, the walls lit themselves at her passing with a pulse that answered the slow thunder of her heart, announcing to whatever courts lay within that the queen had returned and brought with her something the old laws had never accounted for, a mortal boy whose blood could make noon inside a shadow. The Guardian staggered as they reached the great hall, and Vera caught it deftly, her hands leaving streaks of gold where they touched its fur. And when Eli tried to follow, she turned, and for the first time let fear sharpen her voice, telling him to stay close, to say nothing, to keep his eyes on her, and not on the faces that would try to take his courage apart, like a clock whose maker they wished to mock. And then the hall opened like a throat, and he stepped into a room built for proclamations, and last chances, the ceiling higher than any church, the floor inlaid with a map of a world that might once have existed, and upon the dais at the far end, a throne of iron roses waited like the question she had been postponing. They were already assembled, cloaked silhouettes that resolved into courtiers and commanders and priests with collars that flashed like sharpened bones. And at their center, the man from the monastery stood as if he had never lost his blade, smiling up at his queen with the composure of one who has written the ending and is only waiting for the actors to discover it. And when he bowed, it was a wound disguised as respect. He spoke of treason and violations, of a creature resurrected and leashed by a mortal, of a sanctuary broken by blood magic, not seen since the purges. And as he talked, the council murmured agreement in waves that gathered at the base of the dais like tide, and he finished with a gentle request that she surrender the boy and the beast to judgment, so that her reign might be spared the stain of her soft heart, a phrase that made the hall hum with hungry approval. Vera listened without moving, and Eli thought for a moment that she might break under the weight of so many centuries arrayed against the one choice she had made for herself. But when she finally answered, it was in a voice that seemed to come not from her throat, but from the stones of the palace, the sound of water pressing on a dam it has decided to overcome. She named the commander Ardon, and asked him how many times he had used civility as a scabbard for cruelty, how many laws he had filed, down to needles to slide beneath the skin of anyone who troubled his sense of order. And his eyes flickered because only truth has that particular temperature. And she told the council that their purity had made them cowards who hid their fear of change behind the arithmetic of necessity, and that she would not barter a child for their comfort, not now and not ever again. And the word again struck the railings like iron, and the courtiers went very still, because the palace remembered, and memory in such places is a weapon. Ardon shifted tactics with the elegance of a blade changing hands. He said she had been away too long, that exile had taught her nostalgia, that she had forgotten what it took to preserve a people in a world that hated them, and he gestured to Eli with a small, neat movement and asked the queen whether she would risk the return of the hunts and the fires for the sake of a boy she did not know last week, and if her answer was yes, would she at least keep her sentiment private rather than rewriting the law in public, where it might infect the lesser minds with hope. Vera did not look at him then. She looked at Eli, and he saw in her face that she was counting time and chances and blood, and he understood that something more than argument would be required if the room was to remember that fear is not a god. She called for the physicians in their dark robes to attend, and when they reached for the guardian, she folded them back with a glance and knelt herself on the steps, the hem of her coat dark as rain around her, and she slid one hand beneath the creature's ribs where Ardon's silver had drawn that earlier line, and with the other hand, she took Eli's arm and laid his burned wrist upon the same place, and she said aloud what had been true since the fire, that compassion is a bond, and bonds are doors, and doors can be opened from either side. Then, before anyone could protest or praise, she tore her own wrist with her teeth and let her blood fall into the wound where Eli's blood had already burned. And the two met and went to war, and then to wedding, and the hall screamed, not with voices, because shock had shut them, but with wood and iron bending as the room tried to make sense of a light that was neither solar nor lunar, but both, a light braided from noon and midnight and driven by a vow that had never been written down. It raced through the guardian first, filling the body like air fills a bellows, and when it exhaled, it did so not with fire, but with a wind that smelled of clean ash and rain, and its eyes opened on a color no one in the room had seen since they were children, a color that remembered fields and kitchens and streets where someone laughed without hunger, and then the river of it leapt back into Eli, a tide returning to a moon it had decided to claim, and his vision went white and then fell full of images that could not all belong to him. A woman with a baby on her hip singing in a language that made the walls of a cottage glow, a courtyard where roses layered their shadows into coolness while soldiers pretended not to listen to a story, battlefield where a queen who was still mortal chose to rise one more time, when rising seemed pointlessly noble, and when the rush subsided, he found himself on the lowest step of the dais, with Vera's hand gripping his, and the blood slowing at their wrists, and the hall was not dark, but not bright either, rather flooded with a sort of fearless dusk that made the corners honest without making their secrets disappear, and the council stood in it, blinking like people just led outdoors after years at sea. Ardon came to himself first, because men who live by counters and contracts recover quickly when they hear a new market open. He accused her of the oldest crime, the giving of royal blood to a mortal, and said that the punishment for it had been agreed ages ago by oath and fire, and the priests nodded like dolls, and he pronounced the sentence and had already stepped back to let others do the killing when the palace doors opened of their own accord, and the mirrors along the walls turned to face inward, catching nothing and everything, and a sound that was almost laughter, but not kind, rippled along the rafters, as if the building were remembering how often rules had saved the cruel and doomed the brave. Vera stood then, and did not ascend the throne. Instead, she remained beside Eli, so the law would have to look him in the eye, and she said that an old sentence can still be just, but only if it knows the case before it. And she told them that when she gave him her blood, it was not charity but recognition, for his blood had already poured itself into one of theirs, and woken the oldest guard from a grave the council had dug and blessed, and that she had only filled what he had opened, and that what had been created between them was not an abomination but a bridge, and if anyone in the room still knew how bridges work, they would stop trying to set it on fire, and instead consider what might cross if they let it stand. The council shifted. Uneasily, because it is difficult to cheer the burning of a crossing when one is standing on the wrong bank. She went on, the words low but carrying, that from this night forth any human who aids their kind, and any beast of their kind, who answers such aid, will be placed under the Queen's protection, and that no blade or edict would come between compassion and its object without answering to her personally. And she lifted her hand, and the iron roses behind her bloomed, not literally but enough that the court inhaled, and the mirrors along the hall caught not reflections but possibilities, and for a moment the air itself flirted with sunlight. Ardon drew breath to object, and found himself speaking into a wind that did not care for formality. He tried to lunge then, not at Eli because even he knew better than to touch the center of a spell while it was still deciding whether to love or kill, but at the guardians of the law who had not moved quickly enough to cage their queen with tradition, and the motion served him badly. The wind that had earlier exhaled from the guardian now converged in front of him, and it carried on its back all the hands that had been lifted in kindness that the council had called weakness, and the gust was gentle enough to be an accident, yet he flew, coat flaring like a wing that had forgotten how to work, and struck the map in the floor where an old river had been inlaid, and the stone cracked along its pale course, and the hall laughed, again without kindness, and Vera's face, which had been all iron and law, went quiet with a sadness that belonged not to this hour, but to the one long ago when her son had been measured and found inconvenient, and she said she would not kill Ardon, because death served someone like him as a story, but she would break his rank and take his voice and send him to the edges where the night still remembers its manners, and he would work there until he understood the difference between order and mercy, or until the stones forgave him, whichever came last. Then she looked at the priests and asked whether their gods had ever punished anyone for choosing to save a child at the price of a rule, and their silence did not carry courage. When it was done, when signatures had been added to the air like wax that cools without flame, when the courtiers had begun to murmur in a new key that sounded suspiciously like approval seasoned with self-preservation, Vera turned to Eli, and the room blurred again because the thing she had kept for last was the part that would cost them both. She said he was hurt deeper than the body, and that the only medicine was the same as the wound, and she asked permission with her eyes, and he nodded. Because he was tired of refusing the world, and she took his hand and sang, and this time the song was not a key for a door, but the low note that settles a house after thunder, and her blood went to its work, not as a river, but as a root, and the mark on his wrist softened from flame to ember, and the guardian raised its head and breathed in a way that did not promise miracles, but did suggest morning was possible, and the hall, which had been learning to be brave, opened its shutters of fingers with and let in a wafer of dawn that lay across the iron roses and did not burn them, and someone far back began to sob very quietly, because sometimes hope sounds like grief shaken awake. Vira helped Eli to his feet, and when he swayed, she steadied him with a touch that did not tremble, and she told the court to look closely, because this was the shape of the future, messy and bright and unafraid of old names, and then she led him out. the far doors toward chambers where the air was warm and the sheets were linen and the windows faced east. And behind them, the law rearranged its furniture with ill grace. And somewhere on the mountain, the first bird mistook the light for day. And sang, and in that mistake, there was a promise that even the careful could not unhear. Dawn came reluctantly, as though the sky itself was unsure whether it was permitted to rise over such a night. And for a long while the light hovered at the edge of the horizon, pearled and trembling, before it gathered courage and spilled across the mountains. The world below the palace stirred from its long-held breath. Mist lifted from the trees, carrying the scent of resin and new earth, and rivers caught the light and threw it back, as if to prove that flow and change were older laws than any the one council could decree. Inside the black halls of the fortress, torches dimmed of their own accord, and the mirrors that had refused to reflect faces for centuries now caught fragments of color. Skin, fabric, the pale wings of dust motes daring to exist again. Eli woke to the sound of rain striking the balcony railings, though when he looked, there were no clouds, only sunlight refracting through the remnants of the storm that had broken the night. His body ached as if he had carried mountains on his back, yet there was an unfamiliar stillness within him. The hum that had haunted his bones for days now folded into something quiet and immense. The guardian lay at the foot of his bed, no longer shadow nor flame, but a creature of both, its breathing deep and untroubled. When he touched its fur, warmth seeped through his fingers, gentle and steady like the heartbeat of the world itself, learning a calmer rhythm. He rose and walked to the window. The courtyard below, once a parade ground of marble and cold iron, had transformed overnight. Where the wind of Vera's song had touched the stone, flowers had broken through the cracks, their petals pale as moonlight, but edged with gold. The river, he watched a group of them kneel before the throne, not in ritual subservience, but in something closer to reverence or apology. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn, and Vira entered, cloaked not in black, but in a garment of soft gray that made her seem part of the mist. For the first time since he had known her, she did not look like a queen, but like the echo of the woman she might have been before immortality hardened her edges. Yet her eyes, still bright with that inner crimson light, held none of the distance they once had. "You should be resting," she said, and her voice carried the texture of rain on stone. Tired, clean, inevitable. "I've done enough sleeping," he answered. "I wanted to see if it was real." She joined him at the window, her reflection faint in the glass, and together they watched the courtyards and the pale banners that now hung where once there had been only chains. "Real enough," she said softly. Now I learn to rule again, or to stop ruling altogether. The council has been dissolved, its members scattered. Some will repent, others will plot. But they will think twice before raising their blades against what they saw last night. The laws of our kind are no longer iron, they are living, and living things can grow. She turned to him fully then, her hand rising to touch the mark on his wrist. "And you, Eli Harper, you have given the world something neither of us could have imagined. You opened a door I spent centuries guarding. Through it, sunlight will walk where it was once forbidden, and shadow will no longer need to fear its own reflection. Do you understand what you are?" He shook his head. "Not a king, I hope." Her laughter was quiet, unexpected. "No, something rarer. A beginning." She released his hand and stepped back, her gaze drifting to the guardian. "He will stay with you. His time as my servant is ended. He belongs to your line now, to guard those who remember compassion when fear commands otherwise." You'll find he prefers bacon to raw meat, and that he hates thunder. The simplicity of that made Eli smile despite the weight in his chest. "And you?" he asked. "Where will you go?" Her expression flickered. Every queen must eventually become her own myth. There are places where my kind still live in darkness, convinced the sun is their enemy. I will go to them. They will listen, or they will try to kill me. Either way, the world will move forward. She moved toward the doorway, her steps so silent they might have been an illusion, and for a heartbeat, he panicked at the thought of her leaving. "Vera," he said quickly, the name strange and natural on his tongue. She paused without turning. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." She inclined her head slightly, the gesture more intimate than any embrace. "It was not kindness," she said. "It was remembrance." Then she was gone, her form dissolving into the slow light of morning, leaving behind only the faint scent of roses and cold air. The guardian lifted its head and looked at the empty doorway, then at Eli, and its eyes, still carrying that quiet brown that had once belonged to a child, reflected him whole. He understood that she was not truly gone, that her song now lived in the corridors, in the cracks of the stones, in the rhythm of his pulse. Outside, the palace gates opened, and a stream of villagers approached, men and women who had fled during the chaos, now returning to find their world changed. None of them bore weapons. Some carried flowers, others candles, and when they reached the courtyard, they placed them around the river that ran through the broken map, creating a circle of light and color. The courtiers did not drive them away. They simply watched, uncertain, but willing to let the unfamiliar coexist with the sacred. A bird flew down and landed on one of the iron roses, its feathers bright in the sun. The metal didn't burn it. Instead, the rose softened, petals turning pliant, alive. Eli stood at the balcony until the afternoon began to fade. The guardian sat beside him, head resting on his knee, the weight comforting and real. Somewhere far below, he heard laughter, unpracticed, almost shy, but human, and it stirred something in him that felt like peace. He thought of his mother, of the bookstore and the smell of paper and rain, of how frightened she must have been, and he knew he would go back to her soon. The world was different now. He could bring his strange new truth home and not be burned for it. Perhaps she would not understand, but she would see the light in his eyes and know that he had survived, and that would be enough. The sun slid lower, painting the windows gold. He looked down at his wrist, at the faint outline of the sigil that had once burned like a brand, and now glowed softly, as though carved from living light. It was not a wound anymore, but a promise. He turned his palm upward and felt warmth rise from the guardian's fur into his skin, a steady pulse that matched his own. For the first time since the fire, he was not afraid of what would come next. When night finally crept over the mountains, it did not bring the old darkness with it. The sky deepened to indigo, and stars came out one by one, their reflections dancing in the river below the balcony. Eli watched until his eyes blurred, until the shapes of constellations blurred into something like a great map of possibility. The guardian stirred and stretched, then rested its head again. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the land still bound by shadow, a queen walked through forgotten cities, carrying the dawn in her veins. He imagined her lifting her face to the same stars, smiling at the thought that the boy she had saved was now watching them too. A wind moved through the garden, bending the new flowers, and from the far-off hills came the sound of bells. Not mournful this time, but bright, as if the world were learning a new kind of prayer. Eli closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and let the moment settle over him like the gentlest of crowns. a crown made not of iron or fear, but of light that had learned at last to forgive the dark.